Something had to break your heart. More than once. Because if even one of those connections had worked, you would have never met the one who mirrors you. Yes, listen carefully. There is someone who is meant to enter your life. Not to confuse you, not to test you, but to reflect you. And the reason they haven't appeared yet is because something inside you had to be completely cleared first. Every heartbreak you went through, every person who walked away, every connection that felt real but didn't stay. It wasn't random. It was alignment in motion. And right now, you're closer than you think. Part 1, the one that ended before it made sense. Something ended in your life, before it ever had the chance to fully become something. And that's why it still lingers. Not because it was meant to stay, but because it stopped before it made sense. You've tried to move on from it, haven't you? You told yourself it was just another connection, just another person who came and left. But something about it never felt ordinary. It didn't fade naturally. It didn't slowly lose meaning. It didn't unravel over time like most things do. It just stopped, suddenly. And in that moment, you didn't just lose them. You lost the version of reality you thought was about to happen. Because if you're honest, you saw something in that connection. Something real. Something that felt like it was going somewhere. You felt the depth. You felt the pull. You felt something that didn't need to be explained. And that's what made it so confusing. Because when something feels that real, it's not supposed to disappear like that. Not without warning. Not without reason. Not without closure. But that's exactly what happened. And that's why your mind keeps going back to it. Trying to understand. Trying to find the moment where it all changed. Trying to figure out what you missed. Because your heart knows something important. That kind of connection doesn't just end without meaning. So you started questioning everything. You questioned your words, your actions, your timing. You replayed conversations, analyzed every detail, wondered if you gave too much, or maybe not enough. Wondered if you misunderstood what it was, or imagined something that wasn't really there. But no matter how much you thought about it, you never found an answer that felt complete. Because the truth is, the answer was never in what you said, or what they did, or the exact moment things shifted. The answer was in something deeper, something you couldn't see, while you were inside it. Because what ended was never meant to fully unfold. Not because it wasn't real, but because it wasn't meant to continue. And that's a different kind of truth. Because most people think, if something feels real, it's meant to last. But that's not always how it works. Sometimes something feels real, because it's meant to wake something up in you, not stay with you. And that's exactly what this was. A connection that came in strong, felt undeniable, and then disappeared before it could stabilize. Not because it failed, but because it fulfilled its purpose early. And I know, that doesn't make it easier. Because what you felt was real. The emotions, the connection, the way it affected you, that was not imagined. But what you didn't see at the time was how quickly you were attaching to it, how deeply you were beginning to invest your energy, how naturally you were starting to build meaning around it. And if it had continued, if it had lasted just a little longer, if it had given you just enough consistency, you would have gone deeper. You would have trusted it. You would have built something around it. And that's exactly what would have created the problem. Because what you were connecting to was not fully aligned with where you were meant to go. It felt right, but it wasn't complete. It felt deep, but it wasn't stable. It felt real, but it wasn't aligned. And that difference is what you couldn't see yet. Because when you're inside something, you feel it, but you don't always see it clearly. And clarity only comes after separation. That's why it had to end the way it did. Not gradually, not softly, but suddenly. So you wouldn't keep trying to understand it. So you wouldn't keep trying to fix it. So you wouldn't keep investing in something that was never meant to carry you forward. Because if it had faded slowly, You would have stayed longer. You would have held on. You would have made excuses. You would have tried to make it work. But when something ends abruptly, it forces you to stop. It forces you to step back. It forces you to feel the impact immediately. And that's what breaks the illusion. Not instantly, but over time. And maybe you didn't see it back then. But something inside you shifted after that. Even if it was subtle. Even if it was hidden beneath the confusion. Something changed. Because after that moment, you didn't trust connections the same way. You didn't open up as quickly. You didn't invest as deeply without thinking twice. And at first, that felt like damage. It felt like something in you had closed. Like something had been taken from you. But what if that wasn't damage? What if that was awareness? What if that moment was the beginning of you seeing things differently? Not through hope. Not through potential. But through truth. Because sometimes, the connection that ends too soon is the one that shows you what you're capable of feeling, what you're capable of giving, what you're capable of attaching to. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You start noticing things you didn't notice before. Patterns, behaviors, energy shifts. You start recognizing what feels real and what only feels intense. And that distinction changes everything. Because intensity can feel like truth. But it's not always stability. It's not always alignment. And the connection you're being prepared for requires both. Not just depth, but consistency. Not just emotion, but clarity. Not just connection, but alignment. And that's why that first ending had to happen the way it did. Because it wasn't just about losing something. It was about showing you something. Something you would carry forward into every connection after that. Something that would slowly refine your awareness, refine your standards, refine your ability to recognize what is real and what only feels like it. And maybe now, for the first time, you're starting to see it differently. Not as something that was taken from you, but as something that revealed something in you. Because what ended was not your final connection. It was your introduction to the level of connection you're actually meant for. Part 2, the moment you started questioning yourself. And maybe what stayed with you the longest wasn't even them. It was the way it made you feel about yourself. Because after it ended, you didn't just feel hurt. You felt confused. Not just about them, but about you. You started asking questions you never used to ask before. Was I too much? Did I care too deeply? Did I say something wrong without realizing it? Did I imagine something that wasn't really there? And those questions, they didn't come all at once. They came quietly, slowly, but they stayed. Because when something ends without clarity, your mind tries to create it. It tries to fill in the gaps, even if that means turning against yourself. And that's where the real pain began. Not in the ending, but in the meaning you gave it. Because instead of seeing it as something incomplete, you started seeing it as something you lost. Something you could have kept if you had just done something differently. If you had been a little less open, a little less expressive, a little less you. And that thought, it changed the way you showed up after that. Because once you start believing that being yourself leads to loss, you begin to hold parts of yourself back. Without even realizing it, you become more careful, more measured, more guarded. Not because you don't want connection, but because you don't want to feel that again. That sudden shift, that silence, that feeling of being left, without explanation. And what made it harder was that you didn't even have something clear to be angry at. There was no obvious betrayal, no clear mistake. No single moment you could point to and say, that's where it went wrong. It just changed. And that kind of ending is the hardest to process because you're left with feelings, but no answers. And feelings without answers turn inward. They make you question your worth, your value, your ability to be chosen. and kept. And maybe this wasn't the first time you felt that. Maybe this connection just triggered something deeper, something older, a pattern. Because if you look back, there were other moments like this. Different people, different situations, but the same feeling. You showed up fully, you connected deeply, and then somehow, you were left trying to understand why it didn't stay. And after a while, it stops feeling like coincidence. It starts feeling like a pattern. And that's when the doubt gets louder. Because now it's not just about one person. It's about what it says about you. Why does this keep happening? Why do I always feel more than the other person? Why does it start strong but never stabilize? And those questions, they don't just sit on the surface. They go deeper. They start shaping how you see yourself. Because when something repeats enough times, you begin to believe it must be something within you. And that belief, it's heavy, because it makes you feel like, no matter how real something feels, no matter how genuine you are, no matter how much you give, it still won't be enough to make something stay. And that's where the emotional exhaustion begins. Because you're not just dealing with heartbreak anymore. You're dealing with uncertainty, with doubt, with the feeling that maybe you don't fully understand how connection works. Or maybe you're not meant to experience it the way others do. And that thought, it creates distance, not just from others, but from yourself. Because now, you're second-guessing your instincts, second-guessing your feelings, second-guessing what you felt was real. And when you reach that point, you don't trust the process anymore. You don't trust the connection. You don't even fully trust yourself. And that's what makes this stage so important. Because this is where most people lose themselves, trying to become someone who won't be left, trying to adjust to what they think will make things stay, trying to control something that was never meant to be controlled. But here's what you didn't see. While you were questioning yourself, you were also becoming aware of your depth, aware of your patterns, aware of how quickly you attach to something that feels real. And that awareness, even though it came through pain, is what starts to shift everything. Because once you see it, you can't go back to not seeing it. You begin to notice things earlier. You begin to feel when something is off. You begin to recognize what feels aligned and what only feels intense. And that distinction is something you didn't have before. It had to be built through experience, through confusion, through moments that forced you to look deeper. And that's what this was doing. Not breaking you, but revealing something you needed to understand before anything real could stay. Because what you were questioning was never your worth. It was your alignment. And there's a difference. One makes you feel like you're not enough. The other shows you what actually matches you. And right now, even if it doesn't feel like it yet, you're starting to move toward that understanding. Part 3, you always felt it even before all of this. And if you're honest, this didn't start with that one heartbreak, did it? This feeling, this sense that something about you is different. It's been there long before any of these connections. Long before the confusion. Long before the endings. There was always something you couldn't quite explain. The way you see things. The way you feel things. The way you pick up on energy that other people don't even notice. You could walk into a room and immediately sense when something wasn't right. You could feel tension, even when no one was saying anything. You could tell when someone's words didn't match what they actually felt. And at first, you didn't question it. You just thought everyone experienced the world that way. Until you realized they don't. Not everyone feels that deeply. Not everyone notices what you notice. Not everyone connects the way you do. And that's when it started. That quiet separation. That subtle distance between you and everyone else. Because even when you were surrounded by people, even when you were part of something, there was always this underlying feeling. Like you were slightly out of place. Like you understood things on a level that wasn't being reflected back to you. And that creates a kind of loneliness. That's hard to explain. Because it's not about being alone. It's about not being fully seen. Not being fully met. Not being understood. At the level you naturally exist on. And maybe that's why. You've always been the one who listens more. The one who observes. The one who understands others. Without needing much explanation. But when it comes to you, it feels different. Because people don't always see that depth. They see parts of you. But not all of you. And over time, you learn to adjust. To simplify yourself. To hold certain thoughts back. To not say everything you feel. Because you realized, not everyone can meet you there. And that realization, it changes how you connect. Because now, you're not just looking for someone. You're looking for someone who understands. Someone who doesn't just hear you, but feels you. Someone who doesn't just connect on the surface, but meets you where you actually are. And that kind of connection is rare. Not because it doesn't exist, but because it requires a certain level of awareness, a certain level of depth, a certain level of alignment. And that's why the connections you've experienced so far have felt intense, but unstable, deep, but inconsistent, real, but incomplete, because they touched something in you, but they didn't match it. They reflected parts of you, but not all of you. And that's why they couldn't stay. Not because you weren't enough, but because they weren't aligned. And that's a difference you're only starting to understand now. Because before, you thought connection alone was enough. If it felt deep, it must be right. If it felt intense, it must be real. But now, you're seeing something more clearly. Depth without alignment creates confusion. Intensity without stability creates imbalance. And connection without clarity creates attachment, not truth. And that realization, it shifts everything. Because now, you're not just looking for how something feels. You're paying attention to how it flows, how it holds, how it remains consistent over time. And that's something your past self didn't fully recognize. Not because you were wrong, but because you were still learning. Learning your own depth. Learning your own energy. Learning what actually matches you. And that kind of learning, it doesn't come from theory. It comes from experience. From connections that almost worked. From people who almost stayed. From moments that felt real, but didn't last. Because those moments, they weren't mistakes. They were reflections, showing you pieces of yourself, so you could begin to understand what you actually need. And now, you're starting to see it. Not as I'm too much, but as I require something deeper. Not as I'm too sensitive, but as I'm aware on a level others aren't. Not as I don't fit, but as I'm not meant to fit everywhere. And that shift, that quiet realization, is what begins to separate you from the patterns you used to repeat. Because once you understand your nature, you stop trying to force yourself into places, connections, situations that don't match it. And that's where alignment begins. Not when you find the right person, but when you stop accepting the wrong frequency. And maybe that's what's happening now. You're no longer trying to belong. You're starting to recognize. Recognize what feels right. Recognize what doesn't. Recognize the difference between something that touches you and something that actually matches you. And that difference is everything. Because the connection you're being prepared for doesn't just touch your depth. It meets it fully. Part 4 was never just one heartbreak, was it? And if you look back now, you'll start to see something. Not just one ending, but a pattern. Different faces, different stories, different moments. But somehow, the same feeling. It always started the same way. There was a connection. Strong, immediate, almost magnetic. It felt easy at first. Natural. Like something just clicked. You didn't have to force it. You didn't have to question it. It just happened. And in those early moments, you felt it. That sense that this could be something real, something different, something that might finally stay. But then, something would shift. Not all at once. Not in a way you could clearly explain. But slowly, subtly, you would feel it. The energy changing. The consistency fading. The connection becoming unstable. And that's when the confusion began. Because now, you're trying to understand how something that felt so real is starting to feel uncertain. You start asking yourself, did I do something wrong? Did something change? Why does it feel different now? And instead of getting answers, you get distance, less communication, less presence, less clarity. And that's when the pattern completes itself. Because eventually, it ends. Sometimes suddenly, sometimes slowly, but always with the same result. You're left, trying to understand why it didn't stay. And maybe at first, you told yourself it was just bad luck, just timing, just the wrong people. But after a while, after it happens enough times, it stops feeling random. It starts feeling like something deeper, like there's something you're not seeing. Because how can something feel so right and still not last? How can something feel so deep and still fall apart? How can something feel so real and still not become something stable? And that's where the doubt starts to grow. Because now, it's not just about them anymore. It's about you. You begin to wonder, why does this keep happening to me? Why do I always feel more than the other person? Why do things start strong but never stay that way? And those questions, they don't just stay on the surface. They go deeper. They start shaping how you see connection, how you see yourself, how you show up. Because when something repeats, your mind looks for a reason. And if it can't find one externally, it turns inward. It starts creating explanations. Even if those explanations hurt you. Maybe I'm too intense. Maybe I expect too much. Maybe I'm the reason things don't last. And that belief, it's heavy. Because it makes every new connection feel uncertain from the beginning. Because now, even when something feels right, there's a part of you that's waiting for it to change, for it to fade, for it to end the same way the others did. And that anticipation, it changes your energy. You hold back a little more. You question things a little sooner. You protect yourself without even realizing it. Because you've learned, from experience, that what feels strong at the beginning doesn't always stay that way. And that creates emotional exhaustion. Because now, you're not just experiencing connection. You're bracing for its ending. And that takes something from you. Every time. But here's the part. You didn't see while you were in it. It wasn't just repeating. It was refining. Every connection that entered your life showed you something. What you're drawn to. What you tolerate. What you overlook. What you attach to. And each time it ended, it left you with something. Even if it didn't feel like it. More awareness. More clarity. More understanding of what doesn't work. And that matters. Because before, you were experiencing these connections without fully seeing them. You were inside them, feeling everything, trying to understand them as they happened. But now, you're starting to step outside of them. You're starting to recognize the pattern. While it's happening, you're starting to feel when something isn't fully aligned, even if it feels intense. And that awareness, that shift from feeling seeing, is what begins to break the pattern. Because patterns don't continue when they are fully understood. And that's where you are now. Not at the beginning anymore, but not fully at the end yet. You're in the middle of the realization, seeing the connections, seeing the repetition, seeing the difference between what feels real and what actually is. And once you see that, once you truly understand it, you don't go through the same pattern again. Because you don't respond the same way. You don't attach the same way. You don't ignore the same signs. And that's when everything begins to change. Not externally at first, but internally. in your awareness, in your choices, in your energy. And that internal shift is what prepares you for something different, something that doesn't follow the same pattern, something that doesn't collapse the same way, something that doesn't leave you questioning why it didn't stay. Because the next connection is not meant to repeat the past. It's meant to meet you after you've finally seen it. Part 5: The silence that rebuilt you. And then, after enough endings, after enough confusion, something in you stopped. Not completely, not in a way anyone else could see, but quietly, you pulled your energy back, not out of anger, not out of bitterness, but out of exhaustion. Because there's only so many times you can feel something deeply, only for it to disappear, before you start protecting yourself. And that's what you did. You didn't say it out loud. You didn't make a decision in one moment. But slowly, you began to withdraw. You stopped explaining everything you felt. You stopped trying to make people understand you. You stopped reaching out the same way. Because every time you did, and it wasn't met, it took something from you. And eventually, you realized you couldn't keep losing pieces of yourself just to feel connected. So you chose something different. Silence, space, distance. And at first, that silence felt heavy because you were used to connection. Even if it was inconsistent, even if it didn't last, it was still something. But now, there was nothing to focus on. No messages to wait for. No energy to read. No connection to analyze. Just you and your thoughts. And that's where it became uncomfortable. Because without distraction, everything surfaces. Every question you avoided. Every feeling you pushed aside. Every moment that didn't make sense. It all came back. Not all at once, but enough to make you sit with it. And I know that part wasn't easy, because it forced you to face something deeper. Not just the connections, but yourself. How you attach. How you give. How you hold on. Even when something isn't fully right. And that awareness, it didn't feel like growth at first. It felt like loss. Like something inside you had closed. Like something had changed. And you weren't sure if it was for the better. Because now, you weren't reacting the same way. You weren't feeling the same urgency, the same pull, the same need to connect. And that can feel confusing when you've always been someone who feels deeply. But what you didn't realize was that you weren't becoming less. You were becoming clearer. Because before, you were constantly surrounded by noise. Other people's energy, other people's expectations, other people's inconsistency. And it made it hard to hear yourself, to feel yourself, to understand what you actually needed. But in that silence, everything became more visible. Your patterns, your emotions, your boundaries, your depth. And once you see those things, you can't ignore them anymore. You start noticing what drains you, what confuses you, what doesn't match you. And that awareness, it creates distance. Not forced, not dramatic, but natural. You simply stop engaging the same way. You stop investing the same way. You stop attaching to things that don't feel stable. And that's when the loneliness begins to change. It's no longer just emptiness. It becomes space. Space where you're not losing yourself anymore. Space where you're not trying to fix something that was never meant to hold. Space where you can finally just be. And in that space, something else begins to form. Something quiet, but powerful. A sense of grounding. A sense of clarity. A sense of self. Because for the first time, you're not focused on someone else. You're not trying to understand another person, or make something work, or hold a connection together. You're with yourself, fully. And that changes everything. Because now, you're not building your energy around others. You're building it within yourself. And that creates stability. Real stability. Not dependent on someone showing up. Not dependent on something working out. But coming from you. And that's what prepares you. Because what you're being aligned for requires that version of you. The one who doesn't chase. The one who doesn't overgive. The one who doesn't ignore what feels off. The one who doesn't lose themselves in something that isn't fully real. And that version of you could not exist without this phase, without the silence, without the distance, without the loneliness that forced you inward. Because sometimes you don't find yourself by adding more into your life. You find yourself by removing everything that isn't you. And that's what this was doing. Even if it didn't feel like it at the time. Even if it just felt like emptiness. Like nothing was happening. Like everything had slowed down. Something was happening. Something deep. Something necessary. Because in that silence, you weren't just alone. You were being rebuilt. Part 6. The change happened quietly, but it changed everything. And somewhere in that silence, something started to shift. Not loudly. Not in a way you could point to and say, "This is the moment everything changed." But quietly, almost unnoticeably, you became different. Not in who you are, but in how you respond. Because if you pay attention now, you don't react the same way anymore, do you? Things that used to pull you in don't have the same effect. Conversations that once would have kept you thinking all day, now you see them for what they are. You don't chase clarity the same way. You don't try to fix what feels off. You don't ignore that subtle feeling in your chest that tells you something isn't right. And that's the shift. It didn't happen in one moment. It happened over time. Through everything you went through. Every ending. Every confusion. Every moment that forced you to sit with yourself. It all built this awareness. And now, you carry it with you. Without even trying. You've probably noticed it in small moments. When someone says something, and instead of overthinking it, you just understand it. Not just their words, but their intention, their energy. You see it clearly. And instead of questioning yourself, you trust what you feel. That wasn't always the case. Before, you would doubt it. You would second guess. Try to give people the benefit of the doubt. Even when something didn't sit right. But now, there's less hesitation, less confusion, because your awareness has caught up with your experience. And that changes how everything feels. Because now, you're not just experiencing connection. You're observing it. You're noticing patterns in real time. Not after things fall apart, but while they're happening. And that gives you something you didn't have before. Choice. Real choice. Because before, you were reacting. You were inside the connection, feeling everything, trying to understand it as it unfolded. But now, you're not lost in it. You're present with it. You can step back. You can see when something is consistent. And when it's not. You can feel when something is aligned. And when it's just intense. And that difference, it's everything. Because intensity can pull you in. But alignment is what holds. And now, you're no longer confusing the two. And maybe you didn't even realize how much that changed you. Because it didn't feel like a transformation. It felt like calm. Like things slowed down. Like you stopped reacting so quickly. Stopped attaching so easily. Stopped needing things to happen right away. And at first, that calm might have felt unfamiliar. Even uncomfortable. Because you were used to intensity. Used to movement. Used to emotional highs and lows. Used to trying to understand what something meant. But this is different. This is grounded. This is clear. This is stable. And that's how you know. It's real. Because real alignment doesn't feel chaotic. It doesn't leave you questioning everything. It doesn't create confusion that you have to constantly solve. It feels certain. Not loud. Not overwhelming. But steady. And now, you're starting to recognize that. You're starting to feel the difference between what pulls you in and what actually matches you. And because of that, something else has shifted too. You're no longer trying to make things work. You're no longer trying to hold connections together or figure out how to keep someone in your life. You're allowing things to reveal themselves. You're allowing people to show you who they are without trying to interpret it into something else. And that's where your power is. Not in controlling the outcome, but in recognizing the truth early. Because once you see something clearly, you don't have to force anything. You don't have to hold on. You don't have to chase. You don't have to question. You simply know. And that knowing, that quiet clarity, is what prepares you for what's next. Because what's coming into your life doesn't require you to figure it out. It doesn't require you to question, or analyze, or wait for consistency. It meets you already clear, already aligned, already stable. And if you had met that before this shift, before this awareness, before this clarity, you wouldn't have recognized it. Not fully, because you were still operating from a different place, a place that was still learning, still attaching, still trying to understand. But now, you're not in that place anymore. Now, you're aware, you're grounded, you're clear. And that's what changes everything. Because this time, you won't just feel the connection. You'll recognize it. Part 7, it was never just heartbreak, it was preparation. And this is where everything starts to make sense. Because what you've been calling heartbreak was never just loss. It was preparation. I know it didn't feel that way at the time. It felt like something real, being taken away from you. It felt like connection, turning into confusion. It felt like you were being shown something meaningful, only to have it disappear. But what if none of those connections were meant to stay? Not because they weren't real, but because they weren't complete. Because each one of them was carrying a specific role, a purpose, something they were meant to activate in you, not something they were meant to build with you. And that's a completely different perspective. Because most people believe that if something feels deep, it's meant to last. But depth doesn't always mean alignment. Sometimes depth is just recognition. Recognition of something inside you that hasn't been fully seen before. And when that recognition happens, it feels powerful. It feels intense. It feels like something significant is beginning. But in reality, something is being revealed. Not something that's meant to stay. Something that's meant to show you. And that's what those connections were doing. Each one of them, reflecting a different part of you. Your capacity to love. Your willingness to give. Your ability to feel deeply. Your tendency to overlook certain things. Your habit of holding on, even when something isn't fully aligned. They showed you all of it. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Connection by connection. Until eventually, you had seen enough. Because what you didn't realize was that you were being guided. Not toward those people, but through them. Each one, removing something, revealing something, clearing something. And that's why it had to end every time. Because if even one of those connections had continued, you would have built your reality around it. You would have invested deeper, attached stronger, created meaning that felt permanent, and that would have anchored you to something that wasn't fully aligned, something that could never meet you at the level you're being prepared for. And that's why the endings felt so final, so absolute, so sudden in some cases, because they weren't just endings. They were interruptions of timelines that were leading you away from where you're meant to be. And I know that's hard to accept, because it means what you felt was real, but not meant to stay. And that's a difficult truth, because we're taught that real things should last. But that's not always how alignment works. Sometimes something is real because it's meant to wake you up, not because it's meant to stay in your life. And that's what those connections did. They woke you up. to your patterns, to your depth, to your energy, to what you actually need. Not what you thought you needed, not what you were used to, but what truly matches you. And once you begin to see that, everything changes. Because now, you're not looking at those experiences as failures. You're seeing them as steps. Necessary steps. Each one bringing you closer. Not to another temporary connection, but to the one that doesn't leave. Because the connection you're being aligned for doesn't come into your life to teach you through pain. It comes into your life when the lessons have already been learned, when the patterns have already been seen, when the energy has already been cleared. And that's why it couldn't happen earlier. Not because it wasn't meant for you, but because you were still moving through the preparation, still releasing, still learning, still becoming aware. And now, you're no longer in that same cycle. You're not repeating the same patterns. You're recognizing them. And once recognition happens, repetition stops. Because you don't respond the same way anymore. You don't attach the same way. You don't ignore the same signs. You don't hold on to what feels uncertain, just because it feels intense. You see it clearly. And that clarity is what changes your path. Because now, you're not being pulled into connections. You're choosing them. Or more importantly, you're choosing not to engage with what isn't aligned. And that's where the preparation completes. Not when you find the right person, but when you stop accepting the wrong ones. And that's where you are now. Not at the beginning, not in the middle of confusion, but right at the edge of something different. Because now, everything that once broke your heart has served its purpose. It's no longer holding you back. It's moving you forward, towards something that doesn't come to test you, but to meet you. Part 8. The one who mirrors you doesn't confuse you, they reveal you. And now, you're ready to understand something deeper. Because the connection you've been moving toward is not like the ones before. It doesn't begin with confusion. It doesn't leave you guessing. It doesn't pull you in, just to disappear. This one reflects you. Not just your emotions, not just your desires, but your truth. Because the one who mirrors you is not someone you have to figure out. They're someone you recognize. And recognition feels very different from intensity. It's quieter, more grounded, more certain. It doesn't rush you. It doesn't overwhelm you. It doesn't make you question yourself. It meets you exactly where you are. And that's why it couldn't enter your life earlier. Because before, you were still learning to recognize yourself, still trying to understand your own patterns, your own depth, your own energy. And until you can see yourself clearly, you can't fully recognize someone who mirrors you. Because this connection is not based on projection. It's based on alignment. Two people meeting at the same level of awareness, the same level of clarity, the same level of truth. And that's what makes it different. Because before, you were connecting from emotion, from attraction, from potential, from what something could become. But this is different. This is not about potential. It's about resonance. It either matches, or it doesn't. And when it does, you don't need time to convince yourself. You don't need space to analyze it. You don't need distance to understand it. You know, not in your mind, but in your energy. Because everything about it feels consistent. Not perfect, but clear. Not intense in a chaotic way, but strong in a grounded way. And that's what you've been prepared for. Not just a connection that feels deep, but one that remains stable. One that doesn't collapse under pressure. One that doesn't disappear when things become real. One that doesn't leave you questioning where you stand. Because when someone mirrors you, they don't trigger confusion. They reflect awareness. They show you what you've already become, not what you're still trying to figure out. And that's why timing matters. Not external timing, internal alignment. Because if this connection had entered your life earlier, you would have felt it, but not understood it. You would have recognized something, but not been able to hold it, because you were still operating from old patterns, still reacting from past experiences, still attaching to intensity, still trying to make sense of connection through emotion. But now, you're different. You don't chase clarity anymore. You feel it. You don't ignore what's off. You see it. You don't hold on to something uncertain. You release it. And that version of you is the one who can meet this connection fully. Because now, you're not bringing confusion into it. You're bringing awareness. You're bringing boundaries. You're bringing clarity. And that's what allows it to stay. Because this connection doesn't come into your life to teach you through pain. It comes into your life when the lessons have already been integrated, when the patterns have already been broken, when the energy has already been aligned. And that's why it won't feel like the others. It won't follow the same pattern. It won't start strong and then fade. It will start clear and remain consistent, because it's not built on uncertainty. It's built on truth. Two people seeing each other clearly, without distortion, without projection, without trying to turn each other into something else. And that's what mirroring really is. Not copying, not repeating, but reflecting. Reflecting your growth, your awareness, your energy, back to you, in a way that feels undeniable. And that's why you won't have to ask, is this real? Because it won't feel like something you need to question. It will feel like something you've already known, somewhere deeper than logic. And that's the moment everything changes. Because now, you're not searching anymore. You're recognizing. And recognition is what allows connection to stay. Part 9: the signs you're already approaching it. And this is how you know you're not where you used to be anymore. Even if your life looks similar on the outside, something inside you has changed. Because when alignment begins, it doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up quietly, in the way you feel, in the way you respond, in the way you see things now. And if you've been paying attention, you've already noticed it. You don't react the same way anymore, do you? Things that used to trigger you don't pull you in like they used to. You don't feel the urgency to chase answers, to fix confusion, to hold on to something that doesn't feel stable. Instead, you pause, you observe, and more importantly, you choose. That's one of the clearest signs. You're no longer reacting from emotion. You're responding from awareness. And that changes everything. Because now, you're not being pulled into situations. You're deciding if they deserve your energy. And most of the time, you already know the answer. Without needing proof. Without needing time. Without needing to overthink it. And that clarity, it didn't come from nowhere. It came from everything you went through. Every ending. Every moment that forced you to look deeper. Every time something didn't stay. It all built this. This awareness you now carry naturally. And you see it in other ways too. You don't feel attached to the past anymore. Not in the same way. You might remember it. You might still feel certain moments. But it doesn't hold you. It doesn't control your energy. It doesn't define your direction. There's distance now. Real distance. Not forced. Not something you had to convince yourself into. But something that happened naturally. And that's release. Because when something no longer has power over you, it creates space. And that space, it doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels calm, grounded, even peaceful. And maybe that surprised you. Because you didn't expect peace after everything you went through. But that's another sign. You're no longer operating from chaos. You're operating from clarity. And when clarity becomes your baseline, everything that enters your life has to match it, or it simply doesn't stay. You've probably noticed that too. Certain people just don't connect with you the same way anymore. Conversations don't go anywhere. Energy feels off faster. Things fade before they even begin. And that's not loss. That's alignment. Because your energy is no longer available for what doesn't match you. And then, there are the deeper signs. The ones you can't fully explain. But you feel them. A quiet knowing. Moments where everything feels still. But somehow moving at the same time. Like something is coming. Even if you don't know what it is yet. And you don't feel anxious about it. You don't feel desperate for it. You just know. That's not imagination. That's alignment. Because when something is getting closer, your energy begins to recognize it. Before your mind does. And that's why. You've started thinking differently. You're no longer asking, why did this happen to me? You're asking, what was this preparing me for? And that shift, from confusion to purpose, is everything. Because now, you're not looking backward anymore. You're feeling forward. You're open. Not in a way that makes you vulnerable, but in a way that makes you ready. Ready for something that doesn't repeat the past. Ready for something that doesn't collapse. Ready for something that actually stays. And that readiness, that grounded awareness, that quiet certainty, is the clearest sign of all. You're not waiting anymore. You're approaching, closer than you've ever been before. And the reason you can feel it is because your energy is already meeting it. Halfway. Part 10. Nothing was wasted, it was leading you here. And now, for the first time, you can see it differently. Not as a series of heartbreaks. Not as a pattern of loss. But as a path. A path that didn't always make sense while you were in it, but was always guiding you towards something real. Because nothing you went through was random. Not the people. Not the timing. Not even the endings. Every connection. Every moment that didn't stay. Every time you were left trying to understand why. It was all doing something. It was shaping you. Refining you. Clearing you. Not taking from you. But removing what couldn't come with you. And that changes everything. Because now, you're not looking at the past as something you lost. You're seeing it as something that prepared you. Prepared you to recognize what's actually aligned. Prepared you to feel the difference between something that pulls you in and something that truly matches you. Prepared you to stand in your own energy without needing someone else to validate it. And that version of you, the one you've become through all of this, that's the version this next connection meets. Not the version that was still learning, still questioning, still attaching to intensity, but the version that sees clearly, feels deeply, but chooses wisely. And that's why this time, it will be different. Because this time, you're not trying to make something work. You're recognizing something that already does. And that's the shift. From chasing to aligning. From hoping to knowing. From confusion to clarity. And once you reach that point, you don't miss what's meant for you. You don't lose it. You don't have to fight to keep it. Because what is aligned with you stays. Not perfectly. Not without growth. But without the constant uncertainty that you've known before. And that's what's coming. Not another lesson. Not another cycle. But a connection that meets you where you are now. Whole. Aware. Ready. And if you felt this message, if something inside you recognized it, then this isn't just something you're watching. It's something you're experiencing right now. So don't ignore that feeling. Acknowledge it. Claim it. Anchor it. Because the moment you do, you shift fully into alignment. If you're still here, this message was meant for you. So seal it. Comment, I'm ready to meet the one who mirrors me. Or, I release every connection that wasn't aligned. Because once you say it, you're not holding on to the past anymore. You're stepping into what's next. And when you step into alignment, you don't chase what's meant for you. You attract it. And it arrives when nothing inside you is blocking it anymore.